world crowned her the Queen of Soul, a voice that could shake the White House, hush a cathedral, and turn a 3-minute song into a national prayer. Aretha Franklin's anthems, Respect, You Make Me Feel Like, A Natural Woman, Think, did more than top charts. They stitched themselves into the fabric of American life, from civil rights marches to living room radios. But fame is a double-edged light. The brighter it blazes, the darker the shadows it casts at home. Behind the ovations and medals lay 4 lives growing up just off stage, measured not by their names, but by a last name the world could not stop repeating. Tonight we step away from the spotlight and into those shadows to ask a simple, human question that millions never thought to ask. After the curtain fell and the cameras turned away, what really happened to Aretha Franklin's 4 children? And how did each of them learn to live with, outrun, or finally embrace a legacy bigger than any single person? Aretha Franklin, crowned the Queen of Soul, lived a life where the world watched her every move, from her first notes in the Baptist church to her commanding performances on the world's greatest stages. Yet while millions knew the legend, very few ever looked behind the closed doors of her Detroit home. There, 4 young lives grew up not only as children, but as shadows of a cultural icon. Clarence was born when Aretha was just 12 years old, a child raising a child in a world that was never ready to hear such a story. 2 years later, Edward followed, born when she was only 15. Both boys carried the weight of their mother's name without the stability of a traditional household. As Aretha's career soared, her grandmother and sisters often stepped in to help raise the children, while Aretha herself was swept away by the whirlwind of fame. By the mid-1960s, when Aretha married Ted White, she gave birth to her 3rd son, Ted White Jr., later known as Teddy Richards. Unlike his older brothers, Teddy grew up in the direct glow of his mother's success, often standing just off stage as she reshaped American music. And in 1970, her youngest, Kecalf Cunningham, arrived. Born into the height of Aretha's fame, Kecalf would grow up at the center of both privilege and pressure, his path torn between music, faith, and rebellion. 4 sons, 4 different fathers, 4 different eras of Aretha's tumultuous life. Each boy not only bore her name, but also the scars of growing up in a home where the spotlight burned too bright. And as we look closer, we begin to see that while Aretha gave the world her voice, her children inherited her silence, her pain, and her unspoken battles. Number 4. Kecalf Cunningham, the rebel son. Kecalf Cunningham, born in 1970, was the youngest of Aretha Franklin's 4 sons. His father was Ken Cunningham, Aretha's longtime road manager and one of the few men who brought genuine joy into her otherwise turbulent life. But despite being born into a family already defined by music, faith, and fame, Kecalf's path would turn into the most controversial of all. From a young age, Kecalf was drawn to rhythm, but not the kind of soul or gospel that made his mother a legend. Instead, he found his identity in the raw, emerging energy of hip-hop. Blending scripture with street beats, he carved out a persona as God's rapper, a man who saw himself both as the son of the Queen of Soul and a messenger of faith. His lyrics were fiery, laced with anger and redemption, and he stood out as the one Franklin child who dared to fuse rebellion with devotion. For a time, it looked as though Kecalf would carry forward his mother's legacy into a new generation. He performed at community events, church gatherings, and even high-profile stages where his mix of gospel and rap surprised audiences. But as his star began to rise, so too did the shadows of personal struggle. In 2018, just weeks before Aretha's death, Kecalf was arrested for driving under the influence. The timing could not have been worse. As the world prepared to mourn the Queen of Soul, her youngest son found himself in handcuffs, the headlines reminding everyone that the Franklin legacy was far from simple. The years following Aretha's passing only deepened the fractures. Multiple handwritten wills surfaced, and in one version, Kecalf appeared to be named as a key heir to her estate. The courts turned into a battlefield where siblings clashed, each fighting not only over wealth, but also over the right to carry their mother's memory. For Kecalf, the fight became personal. He argued that his mother's handwritten words, tear-stained and shaky, were the truest reflection of her intent. Today, Kecalf lives quietly in Detroit, performing occasionally within church communities and small gospel circles. Gone are the bold proclamations of being God's rapper. What remains is a man who once burned bright with rebellion, but now seems to seek peace in silence. His story raises difficult questions. Can loyalty to a parent's legacy become a burden? And when the whole world claims a piece of your mother, how do you ever claim her as your own? Number 3. Teddy Richards, the silent keeper of memories. Born in 1964 during Aretha Franklin's marriage to her first husband, Theodore Ted White, Ted White Jr. inherited both a name and a storm. His parents' marriage was marked by conflict and abuse, episodes that young Teddy witnessed far too early. Out of that chaos came a boy who quietly absorbed everything, standing at the edge of the stage, watching, listening, learning. Unlike his older brothers, Teddy found his place directly beside his mother. Music became his language, the guitar his weapon against silence. As a teenager, he often accompanied Aretha on tour, sitting in dark corners backstage, studying the band's every move. By the time he reached adulthood, he was no longer just her son. He was her accompanist. Fans at concerts often noticed a tall, quiet guitarist standing behind Aretha, his fingers translating what words could not. That was Teddy. In 1994, he released his own independent project, Love Song for a Dying Planet. It never topped charts or received mainstream acclaim, but within it was a haunting ballad called Her Silence. Listeners who dug deep recognized it as a veiled message to his mother, an acknowledgement of the nights when the world saw her smile while Teddy saw her tears. He rarely spoke publicly about his father, Ted White, the man who left scars on Aretha and shadows in Teddy's memory. When asked about him, Teddy simply said, "I have his name, but not his soul." Of all Aretha's children, Teddy carried himself with the least drama. No arrests, no explosive scandals, no tabloid headlines. Yet that doesn't mean he was untouched by pain. Instead, he chose a path of quiet survival, one defined not by fame, but by resilience. After Aretha's death in 2018, Teddy withdrew even further from public view. He skipped tribute shows, declined interviews, and retreated to a modest life in Michigan, often described by friends as a man guarding his mother's memory. Those who have heard him play say every chord carries the weight of unspoken stories, of love, of fear, of survival. In a family where tragedy seemed to repeat across generations, Teddy became the keeper of silence, the one who bore the responsibility of holding everything together by not saying too much. His life reminds us that not every legacy is carried with words. Some are carried in the spaces between them, in the notes of a guitar, in the silence after the applause. Number 2. Edward Franklin, the sun caught in the shadows. Edward Jerome Franklin, born in 1957, was Aretha's second child, fathered by Edward Jordan. Like his older brother Clarence, Edward entered the world before Aretha herself had truly grown up. She was only 15 when he was born, Still a girl, already a mother twice over. The spotlight was inching toward her, but Edward's childhood was marked less by music and more by absence. He was primarily raised by Aretha's grandmother, Rachel, and her sisters Irma and Carolyn, while Aretha chased the stage. Despite this, Edward inherited something powerful from his mother, her gift of music. As a young boy, he displayed a natural sense of rhythm and a warm, singing voice. Friends and family believed he might be the one to carry Aretha's sound into the next generation. But talent, in his case, was tangled with expectation. In 1980, Aretha introduced Edward on stage at a New York concert. Dressed in a white suit, he stood nervously beside his mother, the Queen of Soul herself. When the time came to sing, however, he froze. Instead of basking in the applause, he retreated into the shadows behind her. That moment became symbolic of his life, always close to the light, yet never quite able to step into it. In the decades that followed, Edward tried to make his way in music. He recorded, he performed locally, but the world never knew him as Edward Franklin. To the media, he was always Aretha's son. That label weighed heavily. Friends described him as sensitive, easily wounded, carrying the unspoken pain of never being seen for himself. His silence deepened when, in 1994, Aretha was honored at the Kennedy Center. Surrounded by her family, she publicly mentioned 3 of her sons, but not Edward. Whether it was a slip or intentional, the exclusion left a wound that never quite healed. Trouble followed. In 2011, Edward was arrested on domestic violence charges. The incident cast a long shadow over him, leading to mandated treatment rather than prison time. For many, it was a sign of a man struggling to cope with mental health battles in the long shadow of an extraordinary mother. At Aretha's funeral in 2018, Edward kept to the back row. He dressed simply, avoided the cameras, and spoke to no one. Yet witnesses said he was the first to enter the private room where Aretha's body lay. He knelt there quietly, whispering something that no one else could hear. Later, a short video leaked of Edward standing at her grave, holding a letter. His words were devastating in their simplicity. "Mom taught the whole world to love through music, but I don't know how to love myself." Today, Edward lives a private life near Detroit. No social media, no spotlight, just the faint echo of what might have been. His story is not one of stardom, but of a man who spent a lifetime searching for identity in a world that only saw his mother. Among all Aretha's children, Edward may be the one who best symbolizes the price of growing up in the shadow of genius. Loved by the world, but invisible at home. Number 1. Clarence Franklin, the silent tragedy. Clarence Franklin, born on January 28, 1955, was Aretha Franklin's first child. His father, according to Aretha's handwritten will discovered years later, was Edward Jordan. But Clarence's story began in whispers and shadows. Aretha was only 12 years old when she gave birth to him. The world saw her as a prodigy gospel singer, a little girl with a voice beyond her years. Few ever asked what it meant for that little girl to suddenly become a mother. From the start, Clarence lived with the weight of being hidden. While Aretha's career soared and her fame became unstoppable, Clarence was raised largely by Aretha's grandmother and other family members. In public interviews, Aretha rarely, if ever, mentioned him. His name didn't appear in glossy magazine spreads or family portraits released to the press. To the outside world, he barely existed. Growing up, Clarence faced learning difficulties and was eventually diagnosed with mental health challenges. He spent years in special education programs and later long stretches in care facilities. Teachers and caregivers often remarked that he struggled not only with his studies, but also with the knowledge of who his mother was. The gap between being the Queen of Soul's son and his reality left scars that words could not heal. One nurse later revealed that Clarence never called Aretha Mom. He would simply say, "That person who sings on TV." In adolescence, Clarence's pain deepened. At 12, the very age his mother had been when she gave birth to him, he began to experience panic attacks. Doctors suggested it was generational trauma, the echo of a wound passed from mother to son. By the 1970s, while Aretha's fame peaked, Clarence slipped further into silence, living away from the spotlight in psychiatric facilities. Family stories hint at heartbreaking moments. In one rare photograph of the Franklin family during Christmas 1981, Clarence stands in the background near a window, his face turned away from the camera. For years, people assumed he was a servant. Only later did family members admit it was Aretha's eldest son, present but unseen, always on the margins. When Aretha died in 2018, her funeral was broadcast across the world. Dignitaries, celebrities, and musicians filled the church. Her children were there, except Clarence. Officially, the explanation was that his health prevented him from attending. But whispers from inside the care facility suggested otherwise. He had wanted to come, but was quietly kept away. One witness recalled him watching the funeral on television, murmuring a heartbreaking question. "Is that your mother?" Today, Clarence lives in a nursing home in Detroit. Now in his late 60s, he rarely receives visitors. Each morning, staff say he plays his mother's records, humming along, sometimes mumbling words he cannot fully remember. His life is a reminder of the unspoken truth, that even the most powerful voices in the world can fall silent at home, and that the price of fame is sometimes paid by those who never chose it. Clarence's story is not one of music, nor of rebellion, nor even of survival in the traditional sense. It is the story of erasure, the child of a legend who grew up invisible. If Teddy carried memory in music and Edward carried pain in silence, Clarence carried the deepest wound of all, the absence of acknowledgement. And in that absence, his life became the most tragic legacy of the Franklin family. The world will always remember Aretha Franklin as the Queen of Soul, the woman whose voice shook mountains, galvanized civil rights, and gave generations a soundtrack for both heartbreak and triumph. But behind the crown was a mother whose 4 sons each carried pieces of her story, sometimes as blessings, often as burdens. Clarence, the eldest, lived most of his life in silence, embodying the wounds that fame never healed. Edward, the second, stood close to the light, but could never escape the shadow of his mother's brilliance. Teddy, the third, chose music as a quiet refuge, becoming the silent keeper of memories rather than chasing celebrity. And Kecalf, the youngest, rebelled through gospel rap, carrying faith and fire in equal measure, before retreating into the same silence that marked his brothers. 4 sons, 4 different paths, yet one unifying thread. Each struggled to find an identity beyond the name Franklin. Their lives remind us that the children of legends are not born into freedom. They are born into expectation. Every triumph is measured against their parents' greatness. Every mistake is magnified by the glare of the spotlight. Aretha gave the world her voice, but perhaps her children inherited her unspoken battles. Their stories ask us to look deeper, not just at the music, the fame, the applause, but at the human cost of living in the orbit of genius. For behind every standing ovation, there may be someone waiting at home, longing not for a hit record, but simply for a mother's love. And so, when we listen to Aretha Franklin sing Respect or Natural Woman, perhaps we should remember that her greatest legacy was not just the songs she left the world, but also the 4 children who still carry her name, her history, and her silence.